A puppy was found in a box. His journey to happiness will make you cry. He was found in the shadows of a back alley, in a battered cardboard box whose flaps had nearly collapsed beneath the weight of the midnight rain. No one noticed at first, not the speeding cars with headlights flashing through puddles, nor the city dwellers rushing home beneath umbrellas held tight against the drizzle. The city's pulse thudded along, oblivious. Then came a single curious passerby. Something about the faint whimper, half drowned by the patter of raindrops, stirred an ache in her chest. She paused just for a moment and leaned down to investigate. That was when she saw the small black nose poking through a hole in the soaked cardboard. A puppy was there, quivering and alone, the white of his fur and matted, his eyes wide with a desperation that needed no words. He was so tiny he could fit in a single palm. His ears were still too large for his head, flopping helplessly as he tried to push himself upright on wobbly legs. The woman found him in that flimsy box, trembling in the chilled air, fighting to breathe through the stench of rotting trash and stale puddle water. She scooped him up, pressing the little creature to her chest, and felt a feeble heartbeat fluttering like a tiny bird's wings trapped in a cage. She looked around, hoping to find someone, anyone, who might be searching for this fragile life. But only darkness and the echo of distant tires on asphalt answered her. She felt her heart tighten with urgency. Something about the puppy's silent plea clutched at a corner of her soul, an unexplainable tether forming in that single heartbeat. Though she had no plans that evening. Indeed, she was walking without direction, letting her mind wander in the hush of the rain. She now discovered a greater sense of purpose. With no time to lose, she cradled the box in her arms and hurried home. Beneath the flickering fluorescence of her apartment's overhead light, she carefully dried him with a threadbare towel. Up close, she could see how frail he was, every rib visible beneath a thin layer of damp fur. His eyes were glassy with exhaustion, and a pitiful whine escaped his muzzle whenever the towel tugged at a knot of matted hair. She prepared some warm water mixed with a bit of dog-safe milk replacer, uncertain but determined to try. He drank in trembling gulps, and with each swallow, his eyes seemed to regain a flicker of brightness. That night, she made a makeshift bed out of a laundry basket lined with old t-shirts. She placed him there gently, half expecting him to whimper in protest. But the puppy curled into a tight ball, burying his muzzle in the soft cotton, and within moments he fell into a fitful sleep. The woman stayed awake well into the early hours, gazing at this tiny creature who'd been abandoned to the elements, left in a box as though he were nothing more than disposable refuse. Something inside her twisted with anger, but above all, with compassion so deep she could hardly contain it. Morning came with the first rays of sunlight creeping past the blinds. The puppy was stirring, and when she peered over the edge of the basket, she was greeted with two bright eyes looking up at her. His tail gave the slightest wag, a timid, hopeful flicker that made her heart skip. As she reached down to stroke his fur, that fragile bond she'd felt the night before grew stronger, like a delicate thread bridging two lonely souls. With each passing day, she named him Lucky, for it felt like a small miracle that she'd stumbled upon him that rainy night. Lucky's fur began to fluff out, no longer damp and matted, but still patchy in places. Where he had once been all bones and sadness, he now blossomed with cautious energy. He'd wobble around the small apartment, snuffling under furniture, discovering corners and chasing bits of lint as though they were prey. And every time she returned home from errands or work, he'd greet her with an excited yip, his tiny tail beating against the floor. But it wasn't an easy road. He was often too weak to keep solid food down. He'd tremble in the night time, waking from nightmares she couldn't soothe with mere words. She'd find him gnawing at the corner of the worn-out couch, or panting as though reliving his harrowing first days. The woman, whose name was, did her best, though resources were scarce. She spent what little money she had on vet visits and special puppy feed to help him gain weight. She struggled with rising debts and looming eviction notices, but never once did she consider abandoning Lucky. He had become her lifeline, her reason for fighting through each day, and she was his. They shared the same sense of vulnerability, the same uncertain future, forging a bond that felt unbreakable. Weeks melted into months, and Lucky grew. He went from a trembling handful of fur to a small but energetic pup with bright eyes and a wagging tail that seemed perpetually in motion. They took walks in the local park, where Lucky pranced and leaped as though he had discovered a magical kingdom. Strangers, charmed by the white and cream fur and the soulful eyes, would kneel to pet him, and he'd respond with unbridled joy, never minding the occasional twinge of fear that still lingered from his memory of abandonment. Found solace in his enthusiasm. She was shy by nature, prone to drifting through life unnoticed, but with Lucky, she found herself talking to people more often. Neighbors, dog lovers, even curious children reached out to them. The puppy's presence opened small windows of camaraderie, warming corners of her heart she hadn't realized were cold. She smiled more freely now, laughter came easier, and a genuine sense of companionship radiated between them. But the city was never a simple place to live. Was behind on rent, her manager had cut her hours at the bookstore, and the burden weighed heavily on her fragile finances. She tried her best to hide her stress from Lucky, maintaining the routine of their daily walks, the evening playtime, the quiet moments where she'd stroke his ears and reassure him softly of how loved he was. Still, reality pressed down like a slowly tightening vice. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling shift, returned to find an eviction notice taped to her door. Panic wrapped its icy fingers around her heart. She clutched the paper, reading it over and over, as though the words might somehow change. Lucky hovered by her feet, nuzzling her calf. The gentle weight of his muzzle against her skin reminded her why she needed to find a solution. This wasn't just about her anymore. She gathered him in her arms and sank to the floor, tears staining the corners of her eyes as she whispered softly, "I won't let them take you from me. I promise." Lucky gazed at her, tilting his head as though he understood her fear. He licked the tears from her cheeks, offering comfort in the only way he knew. In the days that followed, scrambled for every opportunity, extra shifts, part-time gigs, even rummaging through thrift stores to find items she could resell. Every morning, she'd repeat a silent mantra that all would work out, that she would keep Lucky safe. But the city is unforgiving, and time was swiftly slipping through her grasp. Her landlord, having lost all patience, demanded that she vacate by the end of the month. No extension, no negotiation. One night, after she had meticulously packed what few belongings she owned into a couple of suitcases, she stared at the space that had been their home. A wave of memories crashed over her. The little basket where Lucky had first slept, the corner of the living room where he'd excitedly chewed his first squeaky toy, the patches on the sofa where his muddy paws had left footprints that no cleaning product could fully remove. She tried to quiet the trembling in her voice as she murmured, "We'll find a new home, somewhere better." Lucky curled up next to her, resting his chin on her knee, as if to say he believed her, no matter how impossible that dream seemed. With nowhere else to go and no family to turn to, found herself looking up pet-friendly shelters. Most were full or required a waiting list. Desperation churned in her stomach. She couldn't sleep. Visions of Lucky in another cardboard box haunted her. Every time those horrific images surfaced, she'd push them away, reaffirming the promise she'd made that cold, rainy night. On the day they left the apartment, the sky reflected her mood. Dark clouds loomed overhead, threatening a downpour. She slung the backpack of her essentials over one shoulder and carried Lucky in her arms, a single suitcase rolling behind her. They stepped onto the street, the roar of passing buses and the bustle of pedestrians pressing in. Lucky's ears twitched nervously at the unfamiliar chaos. He buried his nose in the crook of his arm, trembling with the memory of once being out in the cold, alone. They moved from one budget motel to another, scraping by for a few days at a time before ran out of money. The cycle of panic and temporary relief was relentless. She'd wake up each morning, job hunt until her feet ached and the sun hung low, then return to whichever small room they'd managed to secure for the night. Lucky grew quieter, still affectionate, but a certain tension weighed on him. He watched with concerned eyes, noticing her exhaustion. One late evening, after being turned away by a cheap motel that wouldn't allow pets, found herself sitting on a park bench, clutching Lucky to her chest. The neon lights of a distant convenience store buzzed in the silence. Tired tears rolled down her cheeks. Lucky nudged her hand, whimpering softly. She sniffled and stroked his head, trying to be strong for him when every muscle in her body felt ready to collapse. That was when a silhouette emerged from the shadows, walking slowly toward them. Tensed, instincts flaring with worry that someone might mean them harm. But as the figure neared, the glow of a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and worry etched into her features. She wore a coat that had seen better days, and a scarf hung loosely around her neck. She stopped a polite distance away and murmured gently, "Are you okay, dear?" Hesitated, pride and fear warred within her. She nodded stiffly, not trusting her voice to remain steady. But the woman saw right through the act. She perched on the far edge of the bench, leaving space so as not to startle. "I'm Myra," she said softly, offering a small smile. She glanced at Lucky. "That's a beautiful puppy." A mixture of relief and shame welled in his chest. She introduced Lucky, her voice faltering, and before she knew it, she was pouring out her story, being evicted, having nowhere to go, holding onto this puppy she'd rescued because she refused to abandon him. Myra listened quietly, the empathy in her eyes unwavering. When finally fell silent, drained and ashamed for having divulged her troubles to a stranger, Myra placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I can't offer much," she said in a voice laced with compassion. "But I have a small place and there's an old shed out back. I can't bring you into my home for reasons that, well, it's complicated right now. But the shed is warm and dry, and I won't ask for any money." Stared at her, heart pounding. The flood of relief was so profound she thought she might faint. "Are you sure?" she whispered, arms tightening around Lucky. Myra nodded. "It's the best I can do right now. No one should be out here alone, especially with a little one depending on you. Let me help, okay?" Unable to form coherent words, simply nodded, tears brimming once again. She followed Myra through the winding streets, eventually reaching a modest house with a neglected front yard. True to her word, there was a small shed in the back, cramped and cluttered with old tools and boxes, but it was indeed dry. There was a small cot, likely leftover from a previous occupant or maybe from storage. Myra apologized for the disarray, but couldn't have been more grateful if it were a four-star hotel suite. Lucky sniffed around, nose in every corner, tail slowly wagging as though sensing the safety this place offered. Myra set down a couple of blankets. "I'll bring you some food, okay? And tomorrow we'll see if we can figure out something more permanent." And so began a new chapter, though had promised herself not to think of it in such terms. She was done labeling her life in neat segments, because every time she did, fate seemed to intervene in ways that upended her. Instead, she tried to live moment by moment, grateful that Lucky had a roof over his head again. Even if it was a shed and not quite a home, it was far better than the alternative. Myra turned out to be a quiet but generous soul. She had her own challenges, medical bills that left her in a precarious situation, and a estranged family she seldom mentioned. But she had offered the little she had without hesitation. Over time, she and developed a sort of friendship. Myra would appear each morning, sometimes bearing a carton of milk or a small bag of groceries. In return, helped clean the yard, fix minor things around the house, and watch Myra's own aging dog, a gentle old mutt named Barney, when she had to go to appointments. Lucky took to Barney immediately, following him around with that insatiable curiosity only a puppy possesses. Although Barney's joints were stiff, he'd indulge Lucky's playful nips and hops. The two dogs would bask in the afternoon sun by the shed, noses lifted to catch the scents of the breeze. Could feel some of the weight lifting from her soul every time she watched Lucky wag his tail in contentment. Yet even in this fragile peace, adversity lurked. Myra's health took a downturn and the bills mounted higher. Her home hovered at the edge of foreclosure, threatened by the bank's looming presence. She tried to hide the letters but saw the strain etched in her features. Own struggles were ongoing. While she found occasional house-cleaning gigs, the pay was meager. She felt an urgent, gnawing guilt, as though she were a burden on Myra's precarious situation. Soon enough, that precariousness bled into reality. One bleak morning, two stern-faced men in suits arrived, stepping onto the porch with a sense of finality. They presented a flurry of documents and though caught only snippets, mortgage defaults, missed payments, final warnings, she felt dread pooling in her stomach. If Myra lost the house, what would become of all of them? The older woman's eyes brimmed with resignation as she tried to reason, to beg for more time, but the men only shook their heads. They left behind a notice that practically screamed the countdown to eviction. Desperate not to watch another person's life unravel like her own, sat with Myra at the small kitchen table, scanning the legal jargon. Lucky lay at its feet, sensing her tension, occasionally looking up with worried brown eyes. Tried to remain calm, but the feeling of helplessness overwhelmed her. She saw in Myra's tired expression the same heartbreak she had worn herself just a few weeks prior: fear of losing a home, the shame of not being able to halt the inevitable. Then an idea lit a spark inside. She remembered reading about local community centers and charities that help people facing foreclosure. Though it felt like a long shot, she convinced Myra to at least try. Together, they compiled the necessary paperwork, arranged appointments, stood in line for hours at cramped government offices with flickering neon lights. Lucky stayed back in the shed during these outings, sometimes under the watchful eye of Barney, who'd whine at the door if Lucky ventured too far. During one of these excruciating waiting periods, stumbled across an employment flyer posted on a bulletin board at the community center. It advertised a caretaker position at a dog rehabilitation facility on the outskirts of the city. Her heart raced. She hadn't known a place like that existed nearby, somewhere dogs with troubled pasts were trained, loved, and prepared for adoption. She pictured Lucky on the night she found him, trembling in that soggy cardboard box, and her resolve hardened. Working with dogs like him felt too perfect to be a coincidence. She hurriedly jotted down the contact information and the required qualifications. While she didn't have formal training, her experiences with Lucky and the dedication she had shown might count for something. She decided right then to pursue it. The next day, ignoring the swirling doubts in her mind, called the number. A woman with a bright, kindly voice answered, naming herself as. She listened with surprising warmth to Story and invited her to come in for an interview. Hands shook with both excitement and fear as she ended the call. The dog rehabilitation facility was located in a more rural stretch, where tall grasses swayed in the breeze and the city skyline dwindled into memory. When arrived, Lucky by her side, she felt a pang of awe. The place was sprawling, surrounded by fences and lined with kennels, each housing dogs of different breeds and ages. Some looked frightened, others barked with excitement. Through the main office window, she glimpsed a wide training arena where a few staff members were guiding dogs through obstacle courses. A petite woman with streaks of silver in her hair greeted in the lobby. Her kind eyes immediately fell to Lucky. "What a handsome boy," she cooed, kneeling to let him sniff her hand. Lucky, always eager to make a friend, licked her fingers shyly, tail wagging in polite curiosity. This interview was unlike any she'd experienced. Instead of peppering her with questions about degrees or certifications, asked about her personal story, her experiences with animals, and her passion. Found herself speaking from the heart, recounting the discovery of Lucky in the box, how nursing him back to health had changed her, how she yearned to help other dogs find a safe haven. She spoke honestly about her financial struggles, but emphasized her unwavering dedication to providing the care that every dog needed. In response, eyes glowed with empathy. "We need people who truly care," she said softly. "Dogs that come here often have scars, both physical and emotional. We do therapy, training, and rehabilitation. We rely on individuals who can empathize with them, who won't just see them as a job, but as souls that need saving." For a moment, felt tears threatened to surface. She realized that, in a sense, she had also been a soul in need of saving. She had found her salvation in Lucky's companionship. Maybe there was a way she could pay that forward. Then toured her around the facility, introducing her to a couple of staffers. They watched how interacted with the dogs that eagerly approached the fencing or cowered nervously in the corners of their kennels. Each time took her time, offering her hand to let them smell, crouching down to appear less intimidating, speaking in soothing tones. And each time she felt a pang in her chest, recalling how Lucky had once been just as frightened, just as lost. When the tour concluded, offered her a position, part-time to start, with the potential for more hours once she had some hands-on training. The pay wasn't extravagant, but it came with a perk that made her heart leap. An option to stay in on-site housing, an old but serviceable trailer used by rotating staff members. It wasn't luxury, but it was a place she could bring Lucky and keep him safe, free from the constant fear of eviction. Accepted without hesitation, tears of gratitude welling in her eyes as she thanked repeatedly. That very night, she returned to Myra's, nearly tripping over her excitement as she told her the news. Myra beamed, embracing. Though they both knew that this meant and Lucky would be moving on, Myra felt only relief and pride, and for her part was determined to keep in touch and to continue helping Myra in whatever small ways she could. The following week, and Lucky found themselves standing beside the trailer that was now theirs to call home. It was modest, certainly, with peeling paint and a cramped interior, but loved it instantly. She stood on the small porch, the sun dipping below the horizon in shades of gold and rose, and breathed in the scent of grass rather than city exhaust. Lucky ran in small circles, sniffing every corner as though mapping out their new domain. In the days that followed, work began in earnest. She shadowed more experienced trainers, fed anxious or underweight dogs, cleaned kennels, administered medication, and above all, lavished attention on these wounded souls. She listened to their stories. Some were rescued from abuse, others were strays that had never known a loving home. There were older dogs abandoned in their twilight years, and puppies that reminded her too much of Lucky's early condition. Each dog carried a story of heartbreak, and each wag of a tail or a timid lick on her hand felt like a fragile victory. Lucky, meanwhile, had full reign of the facility's open play areas when was on the clock. He frolicked under the watchful eyes of the staff or waited patiently near the kennels, sniffing noses through the chain-link fence. He seemed to radiate a hopeful energy that other dogs sensed. Over time, noticed how some of the more fearful canines relaxed slightly when Lucky was around, as though they took cues from his gentle spirit. But even as the weeks went by in a relative calm, noticed an undercurrent of tension at the facility. Seemed preoccupied with something, perhaps funding or limited capacity. The number of new, traumatized dogs arriving was overwhelming, and space was running out. Despite her best efforts, had trouble securing enough donations to expand. She confided in one evening that if they didn't receive some backing soon, they might have to turn dogs away. The thought haunted. She knew all too well what it was like to have nowhere to go. Determined to help, poured her remaining energy into organizing a small fundraiser and social media push for the facility. She crafted heartfelt posts, detailing the stories of some of the dogs who had found hope there. She recounted Lucky's harrowing beginnings, how he had been saved by a simple act of compassion, and how every dog deserves that chance. Her words, raw and earnest, started gaining traction online. Friends of friends shared the posts. Some local businesses chipped in with small donations. It was nowhere near a fortune, but it helped with daily needs, food, medical supplies, even some small improvements to the kennels. As things slowly began to look up for the facility, also received a phone call from Myra. The community center's legal counsel had managed to negotiate a short extension for her mortgage, and she was working out a payment plan. It was tenuous, but it was hope. Felt her spirit lift, feeling as if, for the first time in a long while, the ground beneath her feet wasn't threatening to crumble. Lucky sensed her rising optimism. He danced around her, tail wagging fiercely whenever she returned from her shifts. Then, out of nowhere, a devastating twist arrived. One morning, as was preparing to feed the dogs, she heard frantic barking from the yard. She rushed outside to see staff members gathered around the chain-link fence, their voices tense. Lucky was lying on the grass, whimpering, one paw at an awkward angle. From the corner of the enclosure, another dog, a large, muscular pit mix named Diesel, paced, looking anxious and uncertain. A staff member explained in hushed tones that Diesel, new to the facility and severely traumatized from a fighting ring, might have felt threatened or overwhelmed. Lucky had likely approached too quickly in his friendly way, and Diesel's fear might have caused him to lash out. Heart pounding, sprinted to Lucky. She knelt beside him, gently cradling his head. He was breathing hard, eyes wide with shock. A small gash marred his right shoulder and his paw seemed twisted. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears stinging her eyes. Diesel, seeing's distress, whined from the corner as though apologizing in the only way he knew how. His mind spun, but she forced herself to stay calm. She scooped Lucky into her arms, careful to support his injured leg, and rushed him toward the facility's small clinic. The vet on staff, doctor, examined Lucky with practiced efficiency. His expression was grim as he cleaned the wound and ran x-rays on the paw. Hovered nearby, arms wrapped around herself, guilt and dread swirling in her stomach. She realized with painful clarity that she had grown complacent, letting Lucky wander freely among dogs whose background she only partially knew. She'd assumed that Lucky's friendly nature would disarm them, not thinking about how deep-rooted Diesel's traumas might be. When Doctor finished, his expression softened. He assured her that while the injuries were painful, they weren't life-threatening. The paw was sprained rather than broken, but the gash was deep and required stitches. Lucky would need rest, antibiotics, and constant monitoring to ensure no infection set in. Breathed a shaky sigh of relief, tears finally slipping free. She pressed her cheek against Lucky's forehead, whispering her apologies, telling him he'd be okay, that she would protect him from now on. Back at the trailer, set up a warm, comfortable space for Lucky to recover, a soft dog bed, plenty of pillows, water, and treats. He lay there with a stoic resilience that broke her heart. He still tried to wag his tail whenever came close, as if to reassure her he was all right. But the sight of his stitched shoulder and the bandaged paw felt like a knife twist of guilt. Days passed in a haze of worry and cautious optimism. Lucky improved, albeit slowly. He'd limp around, determined to follow wherever she went. She had to shoo him back to rest more times than she could count. Diesel, meanwhile, was kept under observation. Some of the staff wanted to label him aggressive, but, recalling the fear in his eyes, advocated for his rehabilitation. She refused to let him be judged solely on one tragic incident. Because if there was one thing she believed deeply, it was that no dog should be condemned by a moment of trauma they didn't choose. Her dedication to Diesel, and indeed all the dogs, only grew stronger. She spent more time learning specialized training methods, ways to gently ease abused canines into trust. She saw the parallels between these dogs and human souls battered by life's challenges. Through it all, Lucky was her inspiration. Even with his own injury, he exuded warmth, as though determined not to let fear overshadow his faith in goodness. But fate wasn't done testing's resolve. Late one night, as she was reading by the dim light of a small lamp and Lucky dozed at her feet, her phone buzzed. It was Myra, and her voice trembled with urgency. "I'm so sorry to call you at this hour," she managed in a hushed tone. "Barney has collapsed. I don't know what to do. The vet says the cost of the procedure, I can't afford it. He's in pain." The heartbreak in Myra's voice was palpable, felt a lump in her throat. Barney, the gentle old dog who'd welcomed Lucky in the early days, was likely nearing his final chapter. Without proper treatment, he'd suffer. With it, the bills would be astronomical, something neither Myra nor could easily manage. Swallowed hard, determination flaring. "Take him to the emergency clinic. I'll be there as soon as I can." She called, who picked up despite the late hour. Without hesitation, said she'd try to get in touch with a few of her contacts. Maybe there was a fund or a rescue group that could help cover urgent medical costs. Wasted no time, scooping up Lucky, despite his injury, and rushing to the bus station. The night air was cold and still, and Lucky shivered in her arms, but she was too frantic to focus on her own discomfort. When they arrived at the clinic, Myra was in the waiting area, eyes red and swollen. Barney was in the back, hooked to an IV, struggling to breathe. The veterinarian explained that the dog's heart condition had worsened, and he needed immediate surgery or at least specialized treatment, an expensive procedure with no guaranteed outcome. Myra and both stood there, voices tight with emotion, as they weighed the impossible choice. True to her word, managed to get a charitable rescue on the phone. They pledged a certain amount, but it wasn't nearly enough. Pulled out her meager savings, a result of her part-time work. Myra offered what was left of her own money after the mortgage extension. The veterinarian, seeing their desperation, agreed to a payment plan for the remaining costs, though the sum still loomed dauntingly. With no other option, they signed the paperwork, tears trembling on their lashes. Barney was whisked into surgery. The waiting room hours that followed were an eternity. Clutched Lucky close, mindful of his stitches, her mind drifting to the day she'd found him in that box, the uncertainty that had enveloped them. Now here she was again, heartsick, praying for a dog she'd come to love. Myra sat hunched over in a plastic chair, staring at the tiles, worry etched into every line of her face. At last, the vet emerged, pulling down his mask. There was a long pause as he measured their expressions. "He's stable for now," he said, voice cautious. "We were able to address some of the immediate issues with his heart, but he's not out of the woods. The next 48 hours are critical." Relief crashed over them in waves, though overshadowed by the lingering worry. Barney was alive, and for the moment that was all that mattered. Myra thanked the vet over and over, tears sliding down her cheeks. Throat tight, hugged Myra. Then she placed a trembling kiss on Lucky's head. They had done everything they could. In the days that followed, Barney remained at the clinic, split her time between her duties at the rehab facility and visiting Myra. Lucky's paw steadily healed, his limp becoming less pronounced. Diesel, under careful training, began making small strides in learning trust. And Barney, that kind old soul, clung to life, as though determined to spend a bit more time with the humans who loved him. One crisp evening, received a phone call from Myra that almost made her drop her phone in shock. "He's awake," Myra exclaimed, voice full of tears and joy. "He's weak, but the vet says he's responding well. I'll get to take him home in a few days." That night, returned to the trailer, sat on the step with Lucky by her side, and gazed up at the stars scattered across the endless sky. Exhaustion and relief coursed through her. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment to take stock of everything she'd been through since finding Lucky in that damp cardboard box. It was as if her life had taken 1,000 turns. Eviction, near homelessness, heartbreak, new friendships, new challenges, and small victories that glowed like embers in the dark. Cradling Lucky's face in her hands, she felt the softness of his fur, remembered how he'd once been all skin and bones, a trembling bundle of fear. Now he looked up at her with unwavering trust, tail wagging gently. Tears of gratitude filled her eyes, and she whispered, "You saved me as much as I saved you, didn't you?" Lucky's ears twitched, and he leaned in to nuzzle her cheek. It was at this moment that stepped around the corner, having just finished lockup for the night. She paused, taking in the scene with a gentle smile. "It's a beautiful thing," she murmured, voice carrying in the still air. "You and that pup, there's a bond that can't be broken. I wish everyone who reads about our work here could understand that." Rose, a sudden idea flickering. She recalled how her fundraising posts had garnered moderate attention. What if she took a bolder step, sharing Lucky's entire journey, every detail, from that dreadful night in the box to the challenges they overcame, and how the facility was now helping them fulfill their purpose? Perhaps it could spark a wave of support, not just financially, but also by inspiring adoptions or fostering. She told about it, eyes bright with possibility, clasped her hands together, nodding eagerly, and so poured her heart into writing a deeply personal account. She wrote about the pang of finding Lucky abandoned, the heartbreak of eviction, the kindness of Myra's shed, the second chance at the rehab facility, the accident with Diesel, and now Barney's narrow escape from death. She underscored how each moment, no matter how painful, had woven itself into a tapestry of hope and resilience. She added photos: Lucky as a half-starved pup, Lucky bounding in the grass outside the facility, Lucky recovering with bandages on his paw, and old Barney, eyes kind, resting after surgery. Then she posted it online, on social media, on animal rescue forums, and on the facility's website. At first, there was only a trickle of responses, likes, a few comments from well-wishers. But then something miraculous happened. The story resonated. Perhaps it was Lucky's soulful gaze, or the honesty in its words. Maybe it was the universal longing for hope in a time when so many are weighed down by cruelty and despair. Whatever the reason, the post went viral. Shares by the hour, and soon, donations began rolling in from across the country. People commented about how they were moved to tears, how they wanted to adopt a sheltered dog, how the story reminded them of the time they, too, had faced darkness and found light. The phone at the facility's office rang incessantly. Emails poured in. Offers of volunteer work, adoption inquiries, and corporate sponsorships all flooded their inbox. Within a week, was laughing through tears, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. Diesel found a specialized trainer who offered free sessions to help him overcome his trauma. Barney's medical bills were covered, and Myra, astounded by the kindness of strangers, was able to breathe easier. The entire facility felt like it was bursting with renewed faith in humanity. In the midst of this whirlwind, remained humble. She wrote a follow-up message to express her gratitude, making sure to emphasize that this victory belonged to everyone who cared enough to help. She also gently reminded readers that so many animals were still waiting for their chance, still alone in boxes or cowering in alleyways. The wave of compassion that had begun with Lucky's story now had the potential to save many more. One day, a camera crew from a local news station visited. They wanted to do a piece on Lucky and the rehab facility. Was camera shy, but insisted. And so, standing in front of the camera, Lucky by her side, spoke about hope, kindness, and the endless capacity for transformation, both in dogs and in people. She recalled how Lucky had taught her to never give up, that love could be found in the places, even in a soaked cardboard box on a cold city street. The broadcast aired, and more attention flowed in. People traveled from neighboring states to adopt dogs. Donations exceeded the facility's wildest dreams, enabling them to expand, build new kennels, and offer more medical care. Its role shifted from part-time caretaker to a key member of staff, often referred to her as the heart of the facility. And though blushed at the praise, she also felt an unbreakable sense of purpose. Months after Lucky's story first touched hearts online, the facility held an open house to celebrate the grand opening of a new wing, an adoption center that allowed prospective families to interact with dogs in a warm, welcoming environment. Walked through the crowd with Lucky trotting beside her. Diesel, now calmer and more trusting, was one of the stars of the day, gently greeting visitors with a wag of his once anxious tail. Barney, though slowed by age, made an appearance with Myra, who looked healthier and happier now that the weight of impending foreclosure had lifted. Couldn't help but get emotional as she stood in the center of the brand-new adoption wing. Bright sunlight streamed through large windows, illuminating spotless floors and colorful murals of dogs bounding through fields. Children giggled while meeting dogs for the first time. Smiles stretched across the faces of families who might soon welcome a new furry member into their home. Staff members bustled about, sharing stories of rescued animals who'd found second chances. Lucky nudged's leg and she knelt to stroke his soft ears. She felt tears slip down her cheeks, remembering the battered box in that alley, the fear in his tiny eyes, the endless uncertainties that followed. Here they were, not just survivors but beacons of hope for countless others. It felt surreal, miraculous even. At the end of that day, when the visitors had gone and the facility had quieted, gathered the staff for a small toast. She raised a plastic cup, the corners of her eyes glistening. "To Lucky," she said, voice trembling with emotion. "To his resilience and to how one small life can spark an entire movement of compassion." Everyone clapped, some wiping their eyes discreetly. Felt her heart swell. She recalled the promise she'd made to Lucky when she first held him, that she would never abandon him, that she would protect him, and that they would find happiness together. She realized in that moment just how profoundly that promise had shaped both their destinies. As twilight settled, and Lucky strolled around the facility grounds, the new adoption wing's lights glowed softly, a silent testament to how far they'd come. She sat down on a patch of grass, Lucky settling beside her, head resting on her thigh. She stroked his fur in slow, gentle motions. The sky was awash with shimmering stars, just as it had been on that night she sat on the trailer steps, uncertain but hopeful. This place was now home, a place where she belonged, where she made a difference every single day. She thought about all the dogs still out there, waiting for a second chance. The thought tugged at her heart, but it no longer felt like an insurmountable tragedy. Because now she understood the ripple effect of compassion, that if one puppy could spark this much love, how many more hearts could be ignited by sharing their stories. She whispered to Lucky, voice trembling with gratitude, "We did it. You did it. You're safe now." Lucky's tail thumped softly against the grass. His brown eyes glimmered in the faint glow of the facility lights, and in them saw unwavering trust and endless gratitude. It was a gaze that said, "I know, thank you." And so, the puppy who had been found in a box, a trembling, forgotten creature, went on to become the heart of a story that made countless people cry, hope, and share in a collective moment of kindness. His journey to happiness wasn't just his own. It became a rallying cry for empathy, proof that from the darkest corners can emerge the lights. His frailty had awakened a wellspring of mercy in strangers across the world, and in doing so, he'd not only saved his own life, but also brought salvation to many others. In the end, it wasn't just that Lucky found happiness. He catalyzed it, spreading it far beyond the battered cardboard box where his story began. And for anyone who ever came across his tale, the memory of his tiny, trembling form and his resilient spirit would linger, reminding them that even in our most broken moments, compassion can guide us home.